Welcome to the flight levels. In your private pilot training, you learned about climbing at VX compared to climbing at VY. I don't know about you, but I have always struggled to understand how engineers come up with these speeds. What exactly is thrust? And why does the power required curve look so different from the thrust required curve? All I knew was my instructor wanted me to climb at VY most of the time. Today, we're taking this topic to the flight levels. Let's get to it. Real quick, if you're enjoying this content, please click the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube share my channel. To begin, we need to define a few terms. Thrust is a force exerted on an object measured in pounds. For example, let's take a look at an airplane sitting on the ground stationary with the pilot holding the brakes. Now, let's advance the throttle to perform an engine run-up. In this example, the propeller is generating 600 pounds of force via thrust. Note that there is no time component of thrust. Whether we leave the throttle advanced for 5 seconds or 5 minutes, the thrust is still 600 pounds. The next term we need to discuss is work, which is the application of force along a displacement. In our example of the airplane with the brakes applied, there is a force pulling it, but no work is being accomplished because the airplane is not moving. Once the pilot releases the brakes and the airplane begins to roll, work is now being accomplished. The further the airplane moves, the more work is accomplished. The next term we need to discuss is power. Power is a measurement of the rate of performing work. Another way to say that is how fast the work is done. The main point I want to help you understand is that whenever we are talking about thrust or thrust required, there is no component of time. It doesn't matter how long anything takes. On the other hand, when we talk about power or power required, time matters. There's an inverse relationship between time and power. That is to say, if an amount of work is done in a small amount of time, more power is required to do so. On the other hand, if an amount of work is done in a long amount of time, less power is used to accomplish the work. Next, let's talk about drag. As a quick review, aircraft are subject to two main forms of drag: induced drag and parasite drag. Induced drag is the result of any airfoil creating lift. The higher the angle of attack, the greater the induced drag. Therefore, in straight and level flight, the faster the airspeed, the lower the angle of attack, and the lower the induced drag. The slower the airspeed, the higher the angle of attack, and the higher the induced drag. Parasite drag is the result of drag not associated with the production of lift. The faster the airspeed, the greater the parasite drag. The slower the airspeed, the lower the parasite drag. The combination of both parasite and induced drag for a given airspeed is the total drag the aircraft is subject to. The thrust our propellers create opposes total drag. The amount of acceleration or angle of climb will depend on how much thrust we have compared to how much total drag we have. So far, so good? Excellent! With these concepts in mind, let's start putting them into action on some graphs. Let's take a look at a graph you've seen before. Here we have parasite drag shown in red. As we've said, parasite drag increases with speed. Then in yellow, we have induced drag, which decreases with speed. If we add both parasite and induced drag for a given airspeed, we have total drag shown in orange. We see that total drag at stall speed is relatively high due to all of the induced drag. As speed increases, total drag decreases until we reach L over d max, which is the speed at which total drag is at its minimum. Since this speed gives us the least amount of drag, it is the speed at which the aircraft is the most efficient and gives us the best range. It also gives us the best glide distance. Increasing speed beyond L over d max once again increases total drag due to the rapid rise of parasite drag. Circling back to our discussion of thrust versus power, drag is a force. An airplane's propeller uses thrust to oppose drag. Also, like we talked about, there is no time component for either of these forces. It helps me remember that L over d max, or minimum drag speed, results in the greatest range an airplane will have. Since range is all about distance, it doesn't take into account how long it may take to get there. L over d max gives us the maximum distance we can fly with all other factors being equal. Now let's take a look at a graph of the total drag as well as the thrust available for a generic propeller-driven airplane. It's important that we point out this is for a propeller-driven aircraft. The thrust available is quite different from a jet aircraft, so it is worth pointing out this difference. We can see the thrust available for a propeller-driven aircraft is at its highest at lower airspeeds. Then, thrust slowly diminishes as airspeed increases. Wait, Joe. What the heck? What do you mean thrust decreases as airspeed increases? Why would that happen? I have a comparison to help us understand why thrust available decreases. Imagine you are in a rowboat. When you first start rowing from a standstill, your oar blades can grab a large amount of water and propel the boat forward effectively. However, as the boat's speed increases, the relative speed between the oar blade and the water decreases. You're essentially chasing the water you're trying to push against. To maintain the same thrust, you need to increase your stroke rate or the force you apply with each stroke. Airplane propellers have the same problem. As airspeed increases, thrust available decreases. Staying with our thrust available and total drag graph, let's talk about where to find Vx. Vx is where we have the greatest excess thrust. It may be intuitive to assume this occurs at the point of lowest drag, or L over d max, but take a look at the thrust available at this point. It is substantially lower than thrust available at slower speeds than L over d max. So even though total drag increases as we slow from L over d max, the excess thrust available increases to its maximum at Vx. Vx is not about minimum drag, nor is it about maximum thrust. Vx is all about the speed where we have the maximum difference between drag and thrust. Let's make another example. Let's say we are in an airplane in flight holding altitude at a steady speed of Vx. In this example, let's say Vx is 60 knots indicated airspeed. We likely have a pretty low power setting. Let's say the propeller is producing 500 pounds of thrust, which is opposing 500 pounds of total drag. We are in straight and level unaccelerated flight because the four forces of flight are in equilibrium. The forward components of thrust equal drag, and the vertical component of thrust and lift equal weight. Now let's say we advance the throttle to wide open throttle. Now the propeller is producing 700 pounds of thrust. We could maintain our altitude and increase our airspeed until the forward component of thrust equals drag and we return to unaccelerated flight. Alternatively, we could remain at Vx and use that excess 200 pounds of thrust to climb. It is this excess 200 pounds of force that enables the aircraft to climb. Since we remain at the same airspeed, total drag essentially remains unchanged. Remember, so far we have only been talking about thrust and drag, which are forces. I'm going to beat this concept into you, but forces alone do not have a time component. As such, climbing at Vx gives us the greatest excess thrust, which gives us the greatest change in altitude without considering time. This is the best angle of climb. Okay, we're finally getting to the word you want to talk about. Power! Ha ha ha! At a constant altitude, an aircraft's engine essentially makes a constant amount of horsepower throughout its speed envelope. An important distinction is this constant power is applied at the crankshaft. The power we actually care about is the power that is converted into thrust. To put it another way, the power we care about is the amount of thrust our propeller makes and how fast we are going when this thrust occurs. When we look at a power available chart, we are looking at the result of the thrust available chart multiplied by speed. For example, let's pick any point along the thrust available curve. If we were to move to a higher speed, we see thrust go down. At the same time, since speed is going up, the power available goes up. Power available for a propeller-driven aircraft gently increases up to a point. Then, as thrust available steeply drops off, power available also drops off. If we were then to move to a slower speed, we see thrust available increases. At the same time, since speed decreases, power available has a net decrease. Again, the main way to remember the significance of the term power is to understand that power is just thrust with a time component. Lastly, we have the power required curve. We are going to think of this in a very similar way to the power available curve. Power required is essentially total drag with a time component. Let's start at the speed of minimum total drag, or L over D max, as a baseline. If we were to increase speed, we are not only increasing total drag, but we also increase speed. This results in an increasingly steep power required curve. Now let's go in the other direction. If we slow down, total drag goes up, but since speed is decreasing, the power required has a flatter curve. Now, here's the part that has taken me years to wrap my head around. I hope I can help you grasp this today. As we slow down from L over D max, the decrease in speed and the flattening of the power required curve results in something amazing. The lowest point on the power required curve is at a speed slower than L over D max. This is the speed of maximum endurance for a propeller-driven airplane. Or for you glider pilots out there, minimum power required speed is the speed for minimum sink. The problem I always had with this was, if L over D max is the speed with the least amount of drag, how is it possible that an airplane can stay aloft longer at a speed that has more total drag? Since the speed for max endurance is slower than L over D max, it truly has more drag. The part that took me years to sort this out was the fact that power required is not just total drag, but the speed at which that drag is applied. Since max endurance is at a slower speed than L over D max, even though there is more drag, that drag is applied at a slower speed. Similar to Vx, Vy is not the speed where there is minimum power required. Vy is the speed where we have the maximum excess power. Since power available increases slightly as airspeed increases, the point at which propeller-driven aircraft have maximum excess power is faster than minimum power required. I bet you can see this coming. The best rate of climb has a time component, so it is all about the speed with the maximum excess power. Let's say we are in an airplane in flight holding altitude at a steady speed of Vy. For this example, let's say Vy is 75 knots indicated airspeed. We likely have a medium power setting. Let's say the propeller is producing 120 horsepower, which is opposing 120 horsepower required. We are in straight and level unaccelerated flight because the four forces of flight are in equilibrium. Let's say we advance the throttle to wide open throttle. Now the propeller is producing 180 horsepower of thrust. We could maintain our altitude and increase our airspeed until the forward component of thrust equals drag and we return to unaccelerated flight. Alternatively, we could remain at Vy and use that excess 60 horsepower to climb. It is this excess 60 horsepower that enables the aircraft to climb. Since we remain at the same airspeed, horsepower required essentially remains unchanged. Today we covered the curves of thrust required and thrust available to find Vx. We also looked at the curves of power required and power available to find Vy. Remember, the key to understanding power is to think of thrust with a component of time. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if you learned anything. Share this with any of your friends who may also want to learn techniques to be a better pilot in the National Airspace System. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and head over to flight-levels.com. Remember, don't just fly, climb to the flight levels. If you liked this video, click here to see part 2 of my analysis of what's going on newer in approach control. You're going to love it.